chug, 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 chug,
Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Wizard Staff Podcast. I'm your host, Blake.
And I'm Guy.
And we are two drunk novices who like to talk about EDH. We do drink and swear, so you've been warned. Please drink responsibly when playing children's card games. Tonight, Guy, are you ready to talk about basically what's happened over the last 2 months?
Yep. At the time of recording, it's early February, so this is our first quarter. We got our first big set of the year, so I'm ready to dive in. New cards are great.
Yeah, there's been surprisingly a good number of things to talk about. The main things being like the Secret Lair fuck-ups, Ravnica Remasters, AI controversies, Murders at Karlov Manor set review, and the Rules Committee announcements. So each of these, there's a good number of things to talk about, so we're just going to start diving right into them and kind of giving the background of each. We're not going to be able to cover 100% of each of these events. The goal of each of these is just to say like, hey, this happened, let's talk about it a little bit, kind of voice our personal opinions on things, and just sort of restate the history of events.
Yeah, well said.
But before we do all of that, Guy, what are we drinking tonight? In the middle of the day.
Yeah, that's actually a good point. It is noon, but I'm drinking a Holy Water IPA. It comes from Sumerian Brewing Company, which actually is brewed and packed in Woodinville, Washington.
Hey, that's pretty close to me.
Yeah, it's a citrus IPA, or Citra hops. I don't know what that means.
Neither do I.
It's got a crisp malt body, I guess. Sure. When I think of malt, I think of like malt ice cream. Yes, Blake. I can't articulate in well enough words to say what I really think of this beer. It's a beer. It's okay. Like, I got it in a variety pack. A friend gave it to me, and so I just was, when you were like, all right, let's record, I kind of went to my fridge and was like, what do I got? We'll drink this one today. But what about you? What are you drinking?
On a similar note, I'm like, what do I have in the fridge? And it's what my partner and I often drink just when we're alone together, and it is Twisted Tea, hard iced tea. Which you may be like, iced tea, but it counts because it's alcoholic. And they're in the small market of like alcoholic drinks that are iced tea. There aren't many of them, so Twisted Tea is probably the most available one. They got a couple flavors, but I personally like the original the most. And
like a Long Island iced tea.
I know Long Islands have a reputation of like fucking you up, like real good on just like even one or two. These, I don't say would fuck you up, but they don't taste that alcoholic, which is like why my partner really likes them, because they don't taste the harsh alcohol. And so like I'll like have like 3 or 4, and I'll be like, oh, ooh, okay, and I don't even realize it until it's too late.
Cool.
So that's what I'm drinking.
All right. Well, why don't we get into it? I guess.
Yeah.
So oh, no, go.
Okay. Well, I was just going to say, Ravnica Remasters is probably like the first thing that kind of happened in the year. And this was basically a full reprint set. The most notable thing about this reprint set was the Shocklands. Over the last like couple of years, WotC has been better about reprinting the Shocklands. Whether it's like affordable reprints or like super premium reprints, they've been reprinting them nonetheless, and here we get yet another reprint. So I'm happy to say that the Shocklands are becoming more and more affordable to the average player, and I'd say that's the main highlight of this set.
Yeah, I agree. There's some other Commander classics in here, like Cyclonic Rift, Guardian Project, Protean Hulk. That card was banned for a while, Lilialetna, Dreadhorde General, but it's cool. I like this trend of starting the year with something easy that, you know, we don't need to like focus on, oh, what are all the new cards coming out? Like, you know, this is just like here's a bunch of old cards that like haven't been reprinted in a while. You know, now is a good time to pick them up. It's a good way to start the year, especially after holidays where, you know, you just spend a lot of money. So like these cards come down in price, easy to pick up.
Exactly. I'm still waiting to pick them up just because I'm letting the reprints like saturate the secondary market before I buy all of them. Yeah. And then we took a real nosedive, didn't we?
Oh my god. Yeah. So I think it was like the end of 2023. Magic had a statement talking about how they weren't going to use AI art. And that's been a very controversial topic in just the art community and like, you know, the ethics of it. But WotC said, hey, we're not using it. We want to support our artists. And everyone was like, cool. Probably only like 2 weeks later, like I think this was like one of the very first things, alongside the Ravnica Remasters promotion, they showed an image where, you know, you got a couple of the lands, they're in this like steampunk type setting, and people took a close look and were like,
this looks off.
This is off. Yeah, when you like kind of zoom in, just a few things don't really seem like they make sense, and you're like, this is AI art. But WotC was like, no. We said we're not using it. This image is, you know, purely made by humans. And people were like, no. And it took I think maybe like a week later, and they came out and were like, hey, we're sorry. We were wrong. This is actually AI art. It came from a third-party vendor. I guess like, yeah, they just didn't have like the checks and balances in place to, you know, really know what they're talking about, I guess.
Okay, so the official Magic the Gathering Twitter account made a statement, and it's as follows. Well, we made a mistake earlier when we said that a marketing image we posted was not created using AI. Read on for more. As you, our diligent community pointed out, it looks like some AI components that are now popping up in industry standard tools like Photoshop crept into our marketing creative, even if a human did the work to create the overall image. While the art came from a vendor, it's on us to make sure that we are living up to our promise to support the amazing human ingenuity that makes Magic great. We already made clear that we require artists, writers, and creatives contributing to the Magic TCG to refrain from using AI-generated tools to create final Magic products. Now, we're evaluating how we work with vendors on creative beyond our products, like these marketing images, to make sure we are living up to those values. So, a lot to kind of unpack from that statement. It's kind of their professional way of saying, oops, yeah, we kind of made a mistake. And that's all they really said. That's all they really said. And then, like, I get it, kind of like you hire out to like a third party, and it's a balancing act of how much control or freedom do you give that third party, and how much oversight do you have with those third parties. I get that, but as they said in the statement, it's ultimately down to them to give the final, like, we accept what you the third party have made for us, or be like, no, like, this is clearly AI generated, we're shipping it back. And as lots of people have said in this kind of conversation, it's like concerning just the possible like future where it gets more and more difficult to tell.
Yeah, and I mean, to me too, it's like kind of just shocking, or like, I don't know if irony is the right word, but like, you know, they say this 2 weeks or two weeks before the end of the new year, and just almost like, yeah, pretty much at the new year, it's like, oh no, you fucked up. Like, they quickly made that mistake. So I feel like, before they should have even made the statement of we're not using AI art, they should have kind of gone through, a process. And maybe they did, but maybe they just didn't do it thoroughly enough. I don't know.
So as far as I know, this is the first time AI generated art has made it into the promotional imaging of a product. As far as I am aware, AI imaging has not made it into the final artwork of a Magic the Gathering card.
Yeah, no one else has called that out. I would be kind of shocked if we were able to get that far, just because I feel like a lot of the art community is very against AI art. And, when they had to include drafts and kind of sketches for their work, it shows that you had the fundamentals before the final. So I guess that's probably something that they'll have to do with the AI or like the marketing as well.
Yeah, I mean, I'm aware that like there was an incident like with one of the cards in the Rivals or the most recent Ixalan set where like some artists stole artwork from like another online artist, but that's different. That's a different type of bad. Like,
yeah.
So I know it's all sort of a process. I think what matters most now is to determine whether what's like the art going forward in cards and promotional material, whether it continues to have these issues of having AI art or if they won't. I guess it'll be interesting to see where this is sort of the beginning of things in my mind, and we'll see how the artwork trends going forward, if this becomes a bad repeating pattern or not.
Yeah, I think, that's important, because a lot of people had kind of, jumped the gun and saying like, WotC, making all these terrible decisions. This is the first time that it's happened, and, they eventually corrected themselves, and they said that, going forward, they will make sure to correct these mistakes. So we hope to give them the benefit of the doubt, because, I mean, they do employ all these other people. We do want to support the game that we love. So, yeah, we just hope that they learn from their mistakes, and, we'll see.
Yeah, and since that incident, there were a few artists that have made certain statements that I think kind of give perspective on this whole situation as well, and I'd like to read at least some of that. Like, for example, there's Jason Rainville, who made a Twitter post. They are an artist who has done art for Magic the Gathering. At least in my opinion, one of the most notable was like Storm the Seed Core, which funny enough is like the card art that I said was like the most beautiful and amazing, like literally just a couple episodes ago for like our end of the year review. And so he said, I just let an art director who was asking about work that until this is clarified, I can't lend my skills to Wizards of the Coast. This is, air quotes, final art. Something the company said it won't use AI with. Holding out for it squeaking past art directors. If WotC embraces AI, I'm gone. That said, don't hound artists who stay. Tabletop role-playing game artists is not a stable career at all. Barely anyone has enough savings to just jump ship. Hell, I don't even know what I would do long-term, hoping for a retraction. So, at Wizards, I'm not on the top roster or the most well-known name, but you sure love to use Storm the Seed Core in marketing. I'd love to give you more art like that, if I could get an explanation or a retraction of that art. So, they're talking about the AI art, so that's what one artist had to say. And I kind of appreciate that, where it's like, it's kind of a fine line of like the art community not just like eating itself alive, but like having boundaries within itself to be like, this is not okay. Like the ethics of AI is not okay.
Yeah, and there's another artist, Dave Raposa, who went on and did an interview, and he just fully backed out of, wanting to contribute now to Wizards of the Coast because of this mistake. So I'll link that in our show notes, but he kind of goes over a lot of what we've kind of already said and how there's just not really a checks and balance system there. But yeah, I think, it's pretty clear that the people who are making the art for the game are very against it. So WotC would do best to, make sure that they can correct and move forward.
Mm-hmm. And as a reminder, I feel like this is an important issue. Like, you can look up heuristic studies on YouTube, see how much that video essayist, entire channel is revolved around the art of Magic the Gathering, and see how popular that channel is, and just see how important that is. That's not even going into the more minute details of just how the dimension of the artists are part of the main ecosystem of this card game. It's hugely important. I think not people will give that credit.
All right, I guess, do we want to move on to the next sort of backlash?
Oh yes, I want you to talk about this.
All right, so we don't got one, we don't got two, but we have 3 different fuck ups for Secret Lair. And I guess this first one, the first one is that Secret Lair announced January 2nd, pretty much, second day of the year, that they are no longer doing print-to-demand release. That's been the model that they've done since the beginning, with maybe a few exceptions. But Wizards has now assured that they have, crunched the numbers, and they plan to make enough to likely meet demand for each release. But that does mean that, you kind of have to be on it if you do want to get a Secret Lair that you're into. So already people were wait, why are you doing that? That was the whole point of Secret Lair, is that it was available, and if you wanted one, you would be able to buy one.
Yeah. But Guy, what about the current or the former system where you ordered it online, oftentimes the website would crash, or you would have all these issues with it arriving months and months, maybe even a year later?
I mean,
you could make the case that at least you got it eventually.
Right. There
or you got a refund.
It's no perfect system by any means, but it's it's just kind of disappointing for the people who, because I think that's the big thing. The big thing is when a Secret Lair comes out, maybe you don't have the funds to get it, but that you'll get funds soon, and you can maybe buy it in 2 weeks. Mm-hmm. But if it gets sold out in those 2 weeks, then you're kind of shit out of luck, So
yeah, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but this just sort of serves to make Secret Lair cards even more quote-unquote premium cards. Yep. The reduced, overall, it's going to be reduced availability. Because, let's be honest, when are they ever going to reprint these? Or, I guess you could make the argument, Secret Lairs were never reprinted in the older model, but, the older model made them slightly more available. I don't know. It's going from, bad or, flawed to, even more flawed, is perhaps my perspective.
Yeah. Okay. The second thing is there was the announcement of the 4th Secret Lair Commander deck. We've had Heads I Win, Tails You Lose. We've had an Angels deck. We've had From Cute to Brute. And now we have a Cats and Dogs theme. And that was also, made with a certain number in mind, but sold out very quickly, and many fans were unable to get a copy. And this one had some of the most amount of new, unique art compared to all the other decks. This one had full art lands, that each of these had specific art to the Secret Lair. And so they sold out quickly. People have already gotten them, but there's already been huge markups for the decks. It's just left a bad taste in people's mouth.
Yeah, I mean, I just think about like how popular cats and dogs are, especially cats, because there's Ren and Siri, the half dog, half cat deck, and then there's like Arabo, which is a really popular cat deck. It's sort of like any like veteran established commander player could tell you, oh, this commander deck is going to be like pretty popular, like more so than the heads I win, tails you lose and the other ones.
Mm-hmm.
There's already like a pre-existing like trend and market for this, obviously.
Right. So that's 2, and then the third one is with the Winter 2024 Super Drop that kind of coincides with the big set release of the year, the first of the year. So Murders of Karlov Manor. There was a pretty big, I guess, misprint on Circular of Logic, which I can't even read a majority of these cards just because the art is so, like, it's not consistent between them. So it's like, I don't know where to look for some of this stuff, but it's a counter spell that's printed at sorcery speed, which that's like, that's never what you want on a counter spell, but it's supposed to be an instant. And WotC was like, oh, we messed up. We already printed all of it, so here's $5 off.
Huh? Is that what they did?
Yeah, that's what they did. I mean, I think when Prof did his breakdown of like how much this secret layer costs, aside from the exclusivity of the art, this secret layer was not worth that much to begin with.
Yeah, I didn't see much hype around this set of secret layers at all. The only thing I heard about the secret layers was some of the fuck up.
Yeah, it's, to me, this is kind of the most lackluster secret layer super drop that I've seen in quite a while.
People are always complaining about the power creep of Wizards of the Coast, but I don't know what they're talking about. They made like the same card, but instead of an instant, it's a sorcery.
Oh, wow. That's a good point. Power down.
Powered it down.
It's not even like that's like the best counter spell though, too, It'd be a little different if it was like, let's turn counter spell into like the counter spell into a sorcery, That'd be wild.
Jokes aside, yeah, this is just a terrible mistake. Like, 3 strikes, you're out, WotC. This is bad. It was in such a short amount of time, too.
Yep, it's only been a month and a half.
So, with that being said, we'll talk about something a bit more positive. We'll now move into the next section, which is going to be a little bit longer, take a bit more time, but we're going to do sort of like I don't want to say set review, but like a pseudo set review, where we basically talk about the latest set, Murders at Karlov Manor, and just kind of like plays through it, for lack of a better term. Hopefully this doesn't end up being a 2-hour episode, and if it does, whatever. This is our podcast. We get to do whatever the fuck we want. So, let's talk about it. Murders of Karlov Manor. It's being released February 10th, 2024. And the general background is that it's the 99th Magic expansion. It's basically a backdrop set taking place on Ravnica, which we've been to tons of times before. It's a top-down design murder mystery set. So it features like a bunch of tropes of the murder mystery genre of movies and such. There's tons of like murders and mysteries and like solving a case sort of stuff. You get to be like a detective, you get to collect evidence, you get disguises, you suspect and decipher things, yada yada yada. So the general storyline, I'm going to be honest, I didn't really follow along with it at all. I don't really know what the storyline is. I don't know what the murder mystery is. I don't even know who died. I'm going to be honest. Guy, do you know more about that?
I did watch kind of the Magic Arcanum to get like an idea of what, happened. Teysa Karlov died.
Oh, okay.
There were several guild leaders, like Zagana also died, that were being targeted throughout the set. Like Krenko was a target, but he did not die. I don't want to give away who did it necessarily.
Oh, that's the one thing I did learn.
Oh, okay. But yeah, if you want to learn more, I guess, about the lore, because, you know, I think there have been a lot of times where you can follow the story through the cards.
Through the story spotlight cards?
Yeah, or with stuff like that. This is the first time, though, that they've also incorporated a additional mystery with clues in the game, where there's a couple cards that have actually like different color artworks. There's one where there's like a red curtain versus a white curtain. There's like very few things like this where it's like supposed to then lead into like a QR code AR type mystery. I don't know much about it just because I haven't been following it. But this is like the first time where they've kind of done a step further in the story, which I think is like fine because it's not like this is every set. But yeah, this one just felt like, unless if you were involved from the beginning and you've been following it through, it would be kind of hard to like keep track of like what's been going on.
Yeah, at least props to Wizards of the Coast at the time of recording, where the story is free to read online. So I will give them credit there.
Yeah.
So next up is the themes and mechanics, and we'll just go through this really quick. Basically, there's like 2 new mechanics that interact with face down cards. That's like Disguise and Cloak. Basically, it's like Morph, where you flip over the top card of your deck and make like a 2/2, but this time it has Ward 2, so like whatever targets it is countered unless you pay like the 2 mana or something. Then there's Suspect, which is a keyword action that can be applied to your own or opposing creatures, representing that all eyes are on them as a dangerous criminal. Once a creature has been suspected, it has Menace but can't block. That's okay. Collect Evidence, which I think is probably the more relevant to a commander, where it's a keyword ability representing a cost. To collect Evidence X, you must exile cards with total mana value X from your graveyard. That we might talk about that later. Actually, we'll talk about that later. You have the returning mechanic of Investigate, so you're making like a clue token that takes 2 mana to sacrifice and then draw a card. There's like basic land cycling. Next up, we have card types. There's the new card type of Case, which is a subtype of enchantment. It's very similar to a saga, but there's not really chapters. It's more like you like have a case, and like if you solve it, then it becomes quote unquote solved at like the beginning of, like, either right then and there if you meet that condition, or once you meet the condition later on at the beginning of that next end step, then it becomes solved, and then it moves on to a stronger ability, generally speaking. We'll talk about one of these cards later on. Then there's
I actually would just like to quickly mention, but I think one thing with cases that was a general comment that I saw in the community is it was very hard to understand how like it's solved, really.
Yeah.
And
if it's solved right away or not, regardless of whether you met the condition on end step. Yeah, I was confused by that too. Yeah.
So I don't think I could like fully explain it or confidently explain it at the moment. Do you think you could, Blake, or?
I could. I'll probably bring it up later when we talk about a specific card.
Okay. Yeah. How about that? That's good.
Yeah. Next up in card types, we have the like creature type of Detective. So recently there was the release of the Doctor Who decks, and they came out with the new card type, basically being Detective. And so now we are seeing the continuation of Detective, but this time in Magic IP. And so that's often been sort of a thing that's happened lately, where like a new creature type is introduced in a Universes Beyond product, and then not too soon after, in a Magic IP, it will be a continuation of that subtype. So we're continuing to see more of that. In terms of counters, there's Bloodstain counters and Unlock counters, which don't really matter in this set, so we're going to move on to notable reprints in the main set. And there's really only one, but it's a good one. It's Assassin's Trophy. And Assassin's Trophy is a very good removal spell. I remember when we first reviewed that card. Man, that was so long ago.
Yeah. I remember going over it, and, you know, at the time it was like $30. And it was, I don't know. I mean, personally, I was like, okay, like, we were still so new to the game, I guess, that I was like, I just didn't understand, like, why is this card this much? Like, you know, it seems okay, but yeah.
Do you understand now?
Yeah, totally. For, you know, what it is and the colors it's in. Like, no, it's a solid card. Like, don't get me wrong.
And then next up, we haven't really talked about it much, but as is like the trend these days, whenever there's a main set, there is a corresponding commander decks with this main set. And so there were 4 of them. This time we got notable reprints in the form of Fiendish Duo, which was until now only available in foil and was like a $30 card, right, Guy?
Yeah, this is one that I've been wanting to get a non-foil for quite a while to do some altering. And so I was very, you know, shocked when they actually did that. I was going through, like, the other reprints, but, like, Smuggler's Share was another one that I feel pricey. Like people didn't realize got reprinted, because it was, I think, you know, a pretty notable card in the new Capenna decks, like, 2 or 3 years ago, whenever that was. But that got reprinted, and that was, like, a $15-ish card. And then, like, the other big one is, like, Necromancy.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm. People have not been, like, talking about it enough, but, like, yeah, dude, Necromancy got reprinted after all these years. Like, new art there and, like, updated text to be more accurate with the current rules. Like, It's still a giant block of text and it's a headache to read, but, like, hey, dude, a reprint. The card costs less now. This is great.
Yeah, the art is sick. I really like this new version. And I think it was also not pricey, but, like, it cost, you know, I think maybe $10.
Yeah, about $10 as I remember. And, like, now I don't have to have this weird, like, mummified face looking at me, personally speaking. I know there's plenty of people that you know, art is subjective. People really like the zombified face, like, coming out at you. I personally don't care for it that much. I like this new art more.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And then next up was so in addition to these commander decks, then we had the special guests, which is like a group of about a dozen cards that have these, like, fancy borders and art styles. And so they're a bit more of a premium type of card, but they're preprints nonetheless. And they were of cards like Victimize, Tireless Tracker, Tragic Slip, Ghostly Prison, Show and Tell, Field of the Dead, Gamble, Fabricate, Drown in the Loch, Crashing Footfalls. Some of these are much more relevant to Commander, and some of these are much more relevant to other formats, and some of them are less relevant than others, but I'd say they're all reasonably solid cards that all see play in, like, at least 1 or 2 or 3 formats, yeah?
Yeah, the idea of the special guests is these are cards that are thematically, you know, could work in Murders at Karlov Manor, but for just standard purposes, they're not reprinting these cards into standard, but they're like a special spot on the list, which is now, you know, I think commonplace for the new booster type that was introduced with this set. So you'll see these fairly often with this special art, and they can be, like, played in limited. But yeah, I think these are pretty good. Gamble, you know, good card. Show and Tell, Field of the Dead.
All right, so continuing on with this pseudo set review, let's move into the new commanders. And as always, we'll go in Wooburg order: white, blue, black, red, green, and colorless. So let's get started with white. There's really only one to talk about, and that's Delny Streetwise Lookout. It is 2 and a white for a 2/2 legendary creature, Human Scout. And it says, creatures you control with power 2 or less can't be blocked by creatures with power 3 or greater. So it has, like, evasion for all of your creatures. And if an ability of a creature you control with power 2 or less triggers, that ability triggers an additional time. So it's creating more triggers. Guy, first off, do you see this more as a commander or more as a 99 card?
I've seen more people talk about this in the 99. I don't think I've seen anyone build a dedicated Delny deck, but yeah, I think just the second part with kind of the ability to double your triggers with power 2 or less, like that's what like people are focusing on and, you know, throwing in their decks.
Could you give some examples of cards that would trigger off of that second ability?
Oh my god. You know, Dockside Extortionist. So if you're doing that, then that totally means that you're, you know, building this in a deck that's not dedicated to like mono white exactly.
True. Yeah, like Delny would be in the 99 along with Dockside. Yeah, that totally makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, there's also like, you know, if you're going like the mono white route, but Stoneforge Mystic, go find 2 equipments. Sorry.
I think if you haven't pumped up like your Esper Sentinel with anything, like it triggers off of your Esper Sentinel, because I think Esper Sentinel is like a 1/1.
Yes, you're totally right.
Mm-hmm. And that's one of the really good mono white cards these days too.
Yeah, there's not Ranger Captain. Shoot, what is it called?
Isn't it Ranger Captain Eos?
Ranger Captain's a 3/3 Recruiter of the Guard. That's the 2/2.
Oh,
or
okay,
1/1, I guess. Yeah. So no, there's some pretty good options. Yeah, no, I like this card. I like it.
I agree. I think that it's pretty good. I know it's caused like a bit of a stir in the CDH community just because, you know, generally speaking, competitive EDH decks have very low power toughness creatures because you're trying to be so efficient with your mana curve and with your mana in general. Again, there are exceptions to that, like you've got Crom and you've got like these days like Tivit and a few other things running around like Corvold. But generally speaking, it's filled with all these tons of like really small creatures, and so like the idea of doubling up their triggers and making them evasive, especially like Tymna's, is pretty enticing. So I've heard a lot of back and forth, and generally speaking, at the current moment, it sounds like there's lots of people saying like, oh, this is a kind of overrated for CEDH based on there's too much hype, but that kind of happens with every set, right? Everyone tends to be overhyped rather than underhyped. So we'll see how time passes.
Yeah, I think that's a good call. We'll see.
Yeah. Next up, we have Black Commanders, and this one I am pretty excited about. It is Massacre Girl, Known Killer. It is. So this is the second time we're seeing Massacre Girl as a legendary creature. She is a 2 and black for a 4/4 legendary creature, human assassin with menace. And then pretty uniquely, it has creatures you control have Wither. They deal damage to creatures in the form of -1/- counters, just as a reminder. Whenever a creature an opponent controls dies, if its toughness was less than 1, draw a card. So I've seen a number of people excited about this to build as a commander, but I'd say more so I think people are excited to put this in the 99 of decks, like the main deck. That said, like it's really going to shine in decks that care about -1/- counters, like Hapatra, for example. I think this is going to be an absolute knockout, but I feel like people are also just excited about this card just because it's a really cool creative design. There's not that many cards that give your creatures this buff in a way of giving them Wither, and it's on a relatively affordable body of 4 mana, and then on top of that, like it's enabling itself to draw cards in the long run with that last ability. So I think this card is just super cool. Does it go into every single like mono black deck? No. Does it go in most mono black decks or like multicolor decks? No, but I just really think it's great design.
Yeah, I think it's pretty strong for the decks that want it. But yeah, I wouldn't say like this isn't like a staple by any means. Okay. next we have Krenko, Baron of Tin Street. So we're moving on to red. And this is the third time that we've seen Krenko now. He's a 2 red legendary creature goblin, has haste. Tap, sacrifice an artifact, put a +1/+1 counter on each goblin you control. And whenever an artifact is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, you may pay red. If you do, create a 1/1 red goblin creature token. It gains haste until end of turn, and it's a 3/3. So, the idea is like maybe... I mean, it just goes into like Goblin Matters decks in general. Like, a lot of them care about artifacts, so the fact that you would sacrifice like a treasure, you could use the treasure to then make a goblin with the red, and then pump them all up.
So
pretty solid.
I have a quick question, and it's okay if you don't know the answer. But if I understand this right, you can tap to sacrifice an artifact, and then between putting a +1/+1 counter on each of your goblins, you can pay the red to make a 1/1 red goblin, and then the +1/+1 counter will go on that new goblin token?
Correct, because the sacrifice is a part of the cost to activate it. So artifact hits the field, putting a +1/+1 counter is on the stack, but you have the ability to respond, pay a red, create a goblin, and then that goblin will enter, and then each goblin will get a +1/+1 counter, including the newly made goblin.
Okay, I wanted to bring that up just because I saw some level of confusion of that online, and to be fair, like, unless you have been playing for a while, that's not necessarily intuitive.
No, I agree. I think one thing that I also was kind of like unaware of initially until we got clarification is like, if you have a treasure and you sack the treasure, can you use the treasure or the mana from the treasure to make a goblin? So like, you can basically, if you're like, I don't have a whole lot I want to do with these treasures right now, you could turn all of them into goblins, basically.
Ooh.
Yeah.
That's a good point.
Just another, treasures matter.
This plus Dockside, classic.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that being said, those are kind of the only monocolor new commanders that we really care about talking about. I'd like to move into now the group of multicolor commanders.
Oh yeah, and this was a big one.
Yeah, literally. It is this is a Gruul commander. It is Ansrog the Quake Mole, 2 red and a green for an 8/4. 4 mana 8/4. Very interesting. It is a legendary creature, Mole God. This is the first time we've ever had a Mole God. It's very epic. Whenever Ansrog the Quake Mole becomes blocked, untap each creature you control. After this combat phase, there is an additional combat phase. And then it has an activated ability of 3 red, green. Ansrog must be blocked each combat this turn if able. So, first off, I think this is one of the more popular commanders from this set based on current rankings on EDH Rec, and also based on the amount of talk I've seen online. It's relatively easy to cast with only 4 mana, and you get an 8/4. It's got a really unique creature type that we've never seen before, and I think people are pretty positive about a mole god. And then it's just a unique design where I don't think we've really seen this before, where like, alright, here's this giant 8/4, it becomes blocked. Well, guess what? I'm going to untap all of my stuff and then have an additional like combat. And you could, like, there's certain ways to like make sure that it gets blocked, like the 7 mana activated ability, or you could use like quote unquote lure effects, which forces like your opponent's stuff to block this. And based on the wording, it's like you can basically have additional combat after additional combat after additional combat and basically go infinite in certain ways. And so I think it's really appealing for people on that dimension. Overall, I'd say this is one of the most popular commanders from this set, and it makes sense because it's a really cool design and like pretty much every metric.
Yeah, I mean, if you give this thing indestructible by any means and can, attack, like, yeah, it's just going to clear the board.
Yeah.
So, pretty good. Yeah, I'd say this is probably the most hyped commander that I've seen from Twitter, at least.
Mm-hmm.
But, yeah, looking at, like, EDH Rec, there's, like, 2 other commanders that apparently are more popular, but no, I think this is a pretty solid, unique rule commander.
Mm-hmm. Next up, we have...
Yep.
Oh.
Aurelia, the Law Above. So this is our third time seeing Aurelia? Since this is, like, our 4th time being at Ravnica, it's... we've seen a lot of these characters before.
Yeah, I think this is our 3rd time seeing an iteration of Aurelia.
Okay, so 3 red-white, legendary creature Angel, flying vigilance haste. Whenever a player attacks with 3 or more creatures, you draw a card. Whenever a player attacks with 5 or more creature, Aurelia the Law Above deals 3 damage to each of your opponents and you gain 3 life. So, yeah, this is pretty good. It's definitely, I think, along the lines of more traditional Boros commanders, but with the added, like, card draw on it. I think it makes it very strong. And if you're just able to give this thing lifelink, if you attack with 5 or more creatures, she's going to deal 9 damage across the board. You'll gain 12 life because you'll just gain 3 life back. So it's going to create huge differences. And yeah, it's also whenever a player,
so
it's not like,
yeah, and you're the one that gets all the benefits.
Yep. Mm-hmm. So, this also, like, encourages, or I guess discourages your opponents from going all out when you are the one who wants to go out all out, because if they swing at you with so much, then yeah, you're gonna, like, deal a bunch of damage, and it may not even matter depending on, like, how you equip her.
Mm-hmm. So I see this card being both popular as a commander and in the 99. As the commander, I am curious, how many sorts of effects do you think you need to run where, like, you are, like, forcing your opponent's creatures to attack every combat, or, like, goading them, or making it so, like, you're basically giving creatures that have to attack to your opponents in order to get that draw trigger? Because assuming this is the commander, you're in Boros, and therefore you're very limited at time of recording on the way you get card advantage. Like, you want to get as much, like, as someone who plays a Boros deck, like, you got to find, like, really creative ways to create card advantage. And so, you really want to lean into drawing cards as much as possible, especially if it's stapled onto your commander. And so it's like, I'm curious, like, how incentivized you are to run cards in the 99 that give your opponent's creatures that attack, just so, like, you get the card draw. I don't know. I feel like I'm kind of putting you on the spot here, but I'm curious what you think. Like, or if you don't need to do it at all, because, like, the average casual commander game, like, people are attacking all the time anyway. What do you think?
No, I think goading is a very, plausible thing that you could do with this commander, because, yeah, then you'll just, get people to deal damage to opponents. The goaded creatures can't attack you, obviously, so you're safe. Aurelia will deal some damage, but no, I think that's a very good way to build the deck. It seems like that's probably, like, the way to build the deck.
Boros historically has been struggling as a color identity for commander. We'll see how it does in the future. Next up, we have Judith, Carnage Connoisseur. I think this is the 2nd iteration of Judith we have seen as a commander. It is 3 black and a red for a 3/4 legendary creature human shaman. Whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, choose one. That spell gains Death Touch and Lifelink. Or, create a 2/2 red imp creature token with, when this creature dies, it deals 2 damage to each opponent. So, I don't know about you, but like 5 mana is starting to get a bit expensive as a commander. But I do think the whole, like, whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, choose one of these 2 options, and both of these options are pretty powerful. And so you basically build Rakdos instant sorcery spellslinger, and like you either like can choose the flexibility of like burning your opponents to death with your tokens that can die, and like making your spells Death Touch and Lifelink. That's also pretty powerful. So like I think this is also one of the more popular commanders from this set, and I can see why. Like I can see myself losing to this deck.
Yeah, it is the second most popular commander on EDH Rec at time of recording. And, you know, the deck shows that it runs a bunch of, like, really cheap 1 mana, like, deal damage to each opponent and each creature they control, like End the Festivities, Tectonic Hazard. So it's, you know, you would cast one of those and gain a bunch of life back, and gains Death Touch and Lifelink. So you would kill a bunch of creatures, gain a bunch of life. You know, the 5 mana thing, I agree, is kind of like a little high. Like, you know, pretty much you would want to like cast her and then have like a bunch of follow up, because it's like, you know, cast her, pass the turn. Okay, like, yeah, it's just kind of like, I immediately need to
this
know
kind of
that I need to get rid of this, you know? But I think
it reminds me of a better Fire Song and Sunspeaker.
No, that's fair. And that, yeah, that's a good point, because like I think what's cool, because like traditionally you do think Spellslinger is a blue-red, like is it type deck, but I think, you know, having a black-red or like the red-white Spellslinger type decks like here or there, like that's very interesting. And, you know, I encourage like this kind of design space of like moving some, you know, well-known archetype into a color identity that we haven't seen before. So I think
I like
this is cool.
This spell gains Death Touch and Lifelink because, like, especially within the black-red Rakdos color identity, you can burn through your life total very quickly. So I like the fact that it can mitigate that downside to the color identity by giving it lifelink. Overall, I'm just pretty happy with it.
Oh yeah, because
this one's funky.
All right, now we have the Pride of Hullclade, which is a 10 mana, 10
so it's
and
11
green,
mana.
So 11 mana total. Yep. Legendary creature, Crocodile Elk Turtle. This spell costs X less to cast, where X is the total toughness of creatures you control. So you want cards with big butts. It has Defender. Okay. And 2 blue. So this is a Simic commander. Until end of turn, target creature you control gets +1/+0 and gains, whenever this creature deals combat damage to a player, draw cards equal to its toughness and can attack as though it didn't have Defender. So we've seen quite a few Defender commanders, you know, throughout just Magic's history. I think this one is good. I think along with the Mole God, this is the other one that I've seen people hyped up most, but mainly also because of it being a Crocodile Elk Turtle. Like, it's a very
creature type.
Unique creature type. Yeah. What do you think?
I also agree, where I think this is just a super cool design. Very rarely do you see like this high mana cost with this low power and high toughness, and this like ability to at least cost reduce it to where potentially it only costs a single green mana if you have a bunch of toughness on board. And I also like how it has the downside of Defender, but like it immediately is like, hey, if you have an activated ability of like 2 and 2 blue, you can basically target itself. Not only can it target itself, it can target other creatures, but it can target itself and gain the ability of whenever it deals combat damage to a player, draw cards equal to its toughness, and can attack as though it doesn't have Defender. So it may, like, if you have other defenders, like, you could swing in, but like in theory, like, most likely you're targeting this because this has a huge butt of like 15 and like draw 15, and it's just a super unique design. I feel like in the like last couple of years, you and I and the community at large is like, oh, Simic is such a boring color identity, like yada yada yada, and we just keep saying that because it is. It's like draw cards and ramp, go burr. But this time it's like, you know, this is a Simic commander that's actually kind of unique and cool. Like, this is actually unique. Like, we would build this, and it's kind of refreshing because versus all the Tatiovas and the ACs and Prime Speaker, Vanifar and all the quote-unquote boring Simic commanders that all basically do the same thing of draw cards and ramp and go burr. So, for that reason, I really, really like this card.
Yeah, I did a quick Scryfall, and I think there's only 2 creatures that have higher toughness than this card, and then there's like 2 or 3 others that like tie for it. The 2 creatures having higher toughness being Cherix, which is that crab from
it's a 0/17,
which is like a yep. And then what was the other one? I just saw it. I don't know. But yeah, I agree. Like, this is a more unique way of approaching Simic.
Also, I will say, on a super small note, this activated ability is not a tap. So if you have infinite, like, blue mana, or at least infinite, like, blue and another color of mana, you can give all your creatures plus infinity plus O, and, like, then the rest of the text. So, like, in theory, if you like go wide enough and like have enough creatures to outmaneuver your opponent's creatures, like, you could in theory just like kill them with infinite power in a toughness matters deck, which I find very funny.
Yeah, and actually the other thing too I think is interesting is you can stack it. So you can choose if you could, like, you know, give this ability twice to your creature.
Oh.
And the creature doesn't necessarily need to deal so it needs to deal combat damage, but it doesn't need to deal it just needs to deal 1 combat damage. So like something like, you know, you want to get this thing trample, and it's not going to care how much damage it did because it's just going to read how much toughness does it have, and then it's going to draw the cards.
Yes. Super cool design. I think we've made our case of explaining like why it's super cool, and like I'm totally down to like lose this card. It reminds me a little bit of like Grothama, where I'm like, if you see your opponent play this card, they're probably up to some like mischievous bullshit, and you should be concerned. All right, last up, it is a 3-color commander this time. It is Voja, Jaws of the Conclave. 2 red, green, white. So 5 mana, 5/5, legendary creature wolf with vigilance, trample, and ward 3. Alright, that's pretty good. Whenever Voja attacks, put X +1/+1 counters on each creature you control, where X is the number of elves you control. Alright, so it wants you to play a bunch of elves. But wait, there's more. Draw a card for each wolf you control. Alright, so it wants you to play wolves. So you have a number of ways to do this. Either you could play 100% elves and just make a bunch of +1 counters on your stuff. You could go full wolves if you only care about the card draw aspect. You could play a balance of both, where like you are putting +1 counters on your elves and then drawing based on your wolves. And then maybe you're mixing in some changelings within this Naya color identity, so you can get the best of both worlds, where you're putting +1/+1 counters and drawing cards. I think that's probably what most people are doing, where they're leaning heavily elf, playing some changelings to do both triggers, and then also playing a couple of the low mana, efficient, strong abilitied wolves. I think that's how most people tend to be building this. At time of recording, this is the most popular commander from this set, which I'm not going to lie, Guy, I want your perspective, but that kind of surprised me when I learned about it.
So, one thing I would like to note about this card is it is among 3 cards that were in every pre-release kit. It is a pre-release promo that you could play with if you got in your pre-release kit. Now, a lot of people were like, oh, why isn't it just in the main set? But this was a way of WotC like making strong cards that they could give out and put into... Actually, no, I don't think you could play with it in the pre-release kit. Sorry, you can't play with it in pre-release, but you can play with it, elsewhere. But it's a card that you would get in the pre-release. It's one of 3. Anyway, but this just means I think that there's a higher number of these because, 1 in 3 people who have a pre-release kit are going to open this card. And so I feel like it's just... out there, like it's not going to be that hard to find. And yeah, elves and wolves are 2 creature types that are pretty popular, so it makes sense to me.
Yeah, at first I was confused, but as you kind of said, it made sense to me. We're like, elves are a very popular typal deck, especially like it's really powerful in like mono green strategies, but people do tend to lean into like 2-color commander identities while playing elf typal. But then you get to now with Voja play Naya, and like the problem with elves is that they're small. Well, Voja Voya. I think that's or Voha. I don't quite know how to pronounce the name. Sorry, listeners. Whatever. I really don't care that much. And so I was a little bit surprised, but then like the game nights hosted, which for those who don't know is a gameplay video series hosted by the Command Zone podcast, which is the most well-known and popular commander-based podcast. They released their very popular series of game nights episode, and one of the guests played this commander to a very well degree, showed its strengths, and I think now it's going to continue because each of those episodes gets about 1 million views, and so yeah, I think it's just going to increase the popularity of this commander, especially because it's also one of the only 3-color commanders of this set. Yeah,
there were like a handful, especially for it being Ravnica, but yeah.
So that's pretty much the last commander we're going to talk about. I do want to say, for all of you who are like, there's way more commanders in the main set, and there's way more commanders in the corresponding commander sets. You're absolutely correct. We're still not going to talk about them. You know why? Because we don't have that much to say about them. Like, maybe you could say some niche 1 or 2 things, but at the end of the day, I don't know about you guys, but like I'm kind of tired about talking about tons of cards which are going to see like 0 play or don't have enough niche, interesting design to where like I don't have more than 1 thing to say about them.
Yeah, that's exactly why we do this, where we try and condense the set reviews into these quarterly reviews. So yeah. I say let's just move on to our 99 cards, and we got Assemble the Players, which is 1 and a white. It's an enchantment. You may look at the top card of your library at any time, and once each turn, you may cast a creature spell with power 2 or less from the top of your library. Now, I know it says once each turn, but if the creature does not have flash, that does not mean that you could just cast it from the top of the library.
Correct. Yeah, I'd say the other thing about this card to note is that, as far as I did a quick search, this is the cheapest card, that being at 2 mana value, to let you look at the top card of your library at any time. Which is a notable thing, because it's normally hidden information, right? The top of your library, but just being able to look at that gives you not a large, but a small but important piece of information. You don't have to reveal it. Like, your opponents don't know what it is. And that can be really helpful.
Mm-hmm.
Another thing is it's like once each turn. So in theory, like, you could be playing on your opponent's turns, but as you kind of said, like, you can't cast them even if they have flash. And I'd say that, like, I like this card for the reasons I just mentioned, but the thing I don't like about this card and why I don't actually think it'll see that much play is because this card really wants you to play a quote-unquote white weenies deck. Like, in theory, this is like, it doesn't even have to be a mono white deck. It could be like a Boros deck or a multicolor deck just with small weenies. But to my knowledge, there's not really a commander or a strategy that really asks you to have a deck full of super small creatures like white weenies. And like, we were just talking about elves, but like elves don't really need this card to function. They have so many strong, good cards before this. So I'm just like, A, I don't think there was a really pre-existing need for this card, and B, I don't think this is going to suddenly now create an archetype of that. I think maybe in the future, I may be proven wrong about that, and then this will see play. I'd love for that to happen, but as of right now, like, I don't really see this card actually seeing that much play.
Okay. I mean, the only thing else that I would add is, like, maybe if you do build like a Delny specific deck, like, this is a card I think you would want to include.
Oh,
because
yes.
Power 2 or less is kind of a theme in this set, and a lot of creatures, care about that. So, yeah, that's all I'll have to say.
Again, to reiterate, like, WotC has stated how, like, they're trying to give white as a color identity in Commander more support, and they've looked at their other formats and been like, well, there's white weenie, like, let's try and give an archetype of white weenie support. And it makes sense, but it, like, when you try to translate that archetype over to Commander, you run into issues like everybody has 40 starting life total. It's multiplayer. It now, just the inherent rules of the format kind of changed that archetype and its viability within this format of Commander. And so WotC is making these support cards for White Weenie, but I'm just like, I'm not quite sure if it's enough at this point in time to make it actually come into existence. It might be cool, like, maybe if someone can do that and prove me wrong, I would think that would be awesome. I'd love for someone to do that, but at time of recording, given my knowledge, I don't think that's really a thing that exists yet, and I'd love for it to exist, like, maybe, I don't know, a year, 2 years in the future, 3 years, I don't know. I'd love for it to happen one day, though.
Yeah.
All right, I can read this next card, although I think you might have more things to say about than I do. This is Case of the Pilfered Proof. So this is a case. A reminder, case is one of the new types of cards in this set. It is a subtype of an enchantment. Very similar to a saga, it has vertical art and sort of vertical abilities where you kind of go down from the top to the bottom as long as you meet the conditions. So, that being said, it is 1 and a white for this case enchantment that says whenever a detective enters the battlefield under your control, and whenever a detective you control is turned face up, put a +1/+1 counter on it. Next section says, to solve, you control 3 or more detectives. If unsolved, solve at the beginning of your end step. So just to clarify, if it's solved right away, if you meet that earlier condition, then you can immediately solve it and then go to the solved part. If you don't immediately meet the condition and solve it, you then have to wait, not necessarily that turn, but just whenever, you have to wait until you meet that condition. And then at the end of that end step, then you can go to the very end. I know there was some confusion about that. So once you control 3 or more detectives, then at that beginning of that next end step, then you can go to the solved ability, which is the most important part of this card. If 1 or more tokens would be created under your control, those tokens plus a clue token are created instead. And remember, those clue tokens are like pay 2 mana to sacrifice this artifact, draw a card. So you're basically working towards that very last ability, because in Commander, there's a whole bunch of ways to make tokens, not necessarily creature tokens, but just tokens in general. And then making a clue token in addition to that is like just value. It can, in the right deck, in my opinion, be pretty powerful. The downside, I think, is that there aren't that many detectives in Commander. You can get around that by playing things like, I think, Kindred Discovery, where it forcibly makes all of your creatures a certain creature type. But I don't really think people are like gonna play that type of card in order to enable this very specific card. Maybe they will. Who knows? It's Commander. People can do whatever the fuck they want to do. Prove me wrong. Please do. I think the world would be a more interesting place because of it. But yeah, like I said, like I kind of think about this card in comparison to also to Academy Manufacturer, which has gained popularity since its printing, where like you make 1 token and you basically make 3 instead. I think it's like a food token, a treasure, and then some other type of token. And that card is very popular just because like it can get out of hand the amount of value it generates you in like a token deck. Yeah, but the major downside, like I said earlier, is creating the detectives. I think it's going to be hard to go from the beginning to the end if you don't plan to have enough detectives. Guy, what do you think about this?
You said, Guy, I think you'll have a lot to say about this card. I hadn't really thought much about this card. And then I went on a rant. So, yeah, I was like, no, Blake, you have a lot to say about this card. I guess I do. I've had a bit
to drink.
Yeah, and quite honestly, I've kind of written off a lot of the cases just because I don't, again, I was like, I don't quite understand how this works.
Oh, come on.
I don't really think any of
the... You feel what you don't understand.
I think I do, but like, it's just, I don't want to...
What are you confused about? I'll help.
None of them really...
Talk to me.
Okay, like, to solve, so you control 3 or more detectives. So, okay, this enters the battlefield. Yes. If I do control the 3 detectives...
You solve it right away.
It's immediately solved? Okay. But if not, then it would only check at the beginning of the next end step.
It would check at the beginning of the next end step. It would see you still only have like 1 or 2 detectives, or maybe none, and be like, nope, still can't do it. And it's not going to move on until you have 3 or more detectives on your turn, and then at the beginning of your end step, then it will solve. Does that make sense?
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. I guess, like, there weren't too many cases, too, that I was like, yeah, this is worth solving, that I, like, you know, paid attention to. So, like, to me, I was like, it's fair. Fine. So, no.
How about you read this next card?
This next card, though, I like. So this is Doorkeeper Thrall. It's a 1 and a white creature Thrall. Flash, flying, artifacts and creatures entering the battlefield don't cause abilities to trigger. So it's basically a Hushwing Griffith for less mana and also hates on artifacts. So this is like actual power creep compared to, you know, when we were talking about like Circular of Logic, which is like a step backwards. This is a step forwards. And yeah, no, I like this card. I agree.
It's basically a more powerful version of Hushwing Griff, less mana, as you said. It hates on creatures entering the battlefield, and then in addition, it's like hating on artifacts entering the battlefield, which is relevant in like certain scenarios. I think I need to remind all our listeners, this is not like Stony Silence, where it just like shuts off all activated abilities of artifacts. That's not what this is doing. This is shutting off the ETB triggers of artifacts entering the battlefield, which is not, generally speaking, not as powerful because you're not turning off like mana rocks, which are really prevalent in the format. Yeah, I don't know about you, but like preventing like creature ETBs is very relevant in Commander, even in just like an average casual pod. I say this as someone who plays Phage the Untouchable, and one of the like absolute staples of that deck is for it to work and function, and for me to win at all, I need to play Torpor Orb, which shuts off all creatures entering the battlefield, don't trigger. And so because of that card, because I always play Torpor Orb, I'm aware that like just in the average casual Commander game, like this ability of shutting off creatures like can do a lot. Like people are like, oh, my Elvish Visionary, which I plan to flicker infinitely, no longer works, or the elf that enters the battlefield and destroys target enchantment or artifact, which I can't remember the name of for some reason, like no longer works and stuff like that.
No, it's solid.
All right, next up, our last white card is Trouble in Pairs. I think this is only available in the corresponding Commander decks.
That is correct.
All right, so listeners, keep that in mind. Look out for the Commander decks. Trouble in Pairs. It is 2 white for an enchantment that says if an opponent would begin an extra turn, and that player skips that turn instead. All right. But more importantly, whenever an opponent attacks with 2 or more creatures, draws their second card each turn, or casts their second spell each turn, you draw a card. Okay. Now we're talking. So, first off, we don't really care that much about that first ability of like skipping, like preventing your opponents from skipping turns. It's nice whenever it comes up, but it's not very relevant in the average casual Commander game. But that second ability is super important, where like you're drawing cards whether your opponent attacks with 2 or more creatures, which is pretty common, draws their second spell each turn, which is very common, especially if you have like a player who's like casting multiple spells on their turn and your opponent's turns. Like this helps you kind of keep pace with those players, or cast their second spell each turn, or draws the second spell each turn. Like this is Commander. People draw at least like, I don't know, 3 or 4 spell like cards each turn, especially once their engines get going. Let's be real here. So this is a white card that actually I really like. I think one helpful way for me to think about this is it reminds me of like the red enchantment called Stranglehold, because this is a 4-mana white enchantment. Stranglehold is a 4-mana red enchantment. They both prevent your like prevent extra turns from happening, and then they have an additional benefit. Trouble in Pairs is whitish, where it's trying to like keep you at pace, and Stranglehold is basically saying like nobody can search. Like that being said, Stranglehold is kind of a good Staxy card if like you care about searching, and Trouble in Pairs is good if you care about drawing cards. This is mostly a white draw engine card, which I'm not like. I think with 4 mana, it may be a little bit slow, but like we're mono white, we want card advantage, and so I think it's worth playing. Like I'm planning to buy this card. It kind of reminds me also a little bit of Mangara the Diplomat, if Mangara the Diplomat was actually good.
Yeah, I mean, I think the big thing for me on this is like attacking, drawing, and casting spells are very
relevant,
common, core, relevant
actions that
in the game. So it's pretty easy. Like in a way, it's almost like another rule of law to me, where it's like you only want to do one of these things, or else I'm going to get a benefit. So it also again like discourages players from doing too much and kind of keeping everyone at pace.
Yes, I very much like this card.
Alright, the next card is Case of the Ransacked Lab. It's 2 and a blue. Instant and sorcery spells you cast cost 1 less to cast. So that is just static. Don't need to do anything. To solve the case, you've cast 4 or more instant or sorcery spells this turn. So once solved, whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, draw a card. I think this is just very good in spellslinger type decks. Any deck that's going to be like cast a lot of spells. This is just going to, rebate you, making things cheaper and drawing you cards to cast more spells.
Yep, I think it's pretty much everything a instant sorcery spellslinger deck that includes blue will want. It's reasonably affordable at 3 mana. It's one of those case cards. I think this is probably one of the better cases. I think it's probably one of the best cases, I'd argue.
Yeah, I agree.
Next up is a card I'll read real quick. It just has a very interesting design I think is worth talking about a little bit. It's Conspiracy Unraveler. 5 blue, so 7 mana value. It is a 6/6 creature Sphinx detective with flying, obviously. And it says you may collect evidence 10 rather than pay the mana cost for spells you cast. So as a reminder, to collect evidence 10, exile cards with total mana value 10 or greater from your graveyard. So, right off the bat, people have been talking about how the Sphinx is comparable to Omniscience. Omniscience is notably like I think a 10 mana enchantment that says like you may cast spells for free basically from your hand. And so this is a little bit cheaper at 7 mana. It's a creature instead of an enchantment, so it's easier to like remove, generally speaking. However, the major downside to the Sphinx is the fact that you have to like collect evidence 10. So there's still an actual cost to your spells. It's like you're having to exile like actual cards from your graveyard. So I'd say if you're actually playing this very quote unquote Timmy card, it's a very casual card, like you have to like be a graveyard, like fill up your graveyard pretty consistently and fill it up a lot, because, and especially like more towards casual, because let's remember that like CEDH, and generally speaking, the more higher power level you get, generally speaking, your mana curve tends to get lower and lower. So this really only works if you're able to have high mana value cards in your graveyard. And because collect evidence 10 like is a pretty high number, like you're exiling like 3 or 4 spells, each of them costing like 2 to 4 mana, which is reasonable. It's not like Delve where like you can use your lands to meet the Delve cost. Lands have 0 CMC, so lands don't help you with collect evidence like whatever number. And that's like one of the major upsides with Delve, is that like you can just get rid of the lands you no longer use or care about. So collect evidence in my mind is a little bit like a weakened Delve. Guy, what do you think?
Yeah, I think the nice thing about this, at least, is that you can bypass having to cast mana, but you do need a deck that would probably have a large graveyard. Like, Bruvac is one that comes to my mind, because it's like whenever a player mills a card, it's like double the mill. Yeah. So you would want to mill yourself. And you also... You may collect evidence 10 rather than...
I think that's a great example. I think Bruvac, like a mill deck that can mill itself very efficiently, like just mill half your deck, like now the Sphinx is like super duper online and you can just like probably win that turn. Like, yeah.
Yeah, and I think the other nice thing too, I guess, is like it doesn't... blue is often a instant sorceries type deck, but this... can just be for any of your spells, so it doesn't matter. Like, it could be creatures, it could be artifacts. Like, yes.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a common thing I'm going to say about the rest of this set and this set in general is like, even when there are cards that say like as an additional cost or like an alternative casting cost, the alternative casting cost or additional cost is still appropriately costed. In this entire set, I don't think that there's any like busted card. In this set, I don't think there's any like equivalent card to like Dockside Extortionist. There's no busted card.
No, it's been a long time that I think we've seen any card on that power level.
That being said, this next card is powerful, but I still think it has certain characteristics about it that make it niche. And Guy, why don't you talk about it?
Okay, so it's Forensic Gadgeteer, 2 and a blue, creature Vidalcan Artificer Detective. That's a mouthful. Whenever you cast an artifact spell, investigate. Okay. Activated abilities of artifacts you control cost 1 less to cast. This effect can't reduce the mana in that to cost to less than 1 mana. So, I mean, the big ones, Grim Monolith, Basalt Monolith, which tap for mana and then require a certain amount to untap. Those are the ones that, like, immediately just
make infinite colorless mana.
Like, this is almost like a, like power artifact,
Yeah.
That's a reserved list card. This, I think, is like a good way of like also just introducing those kinds of abilities in a more affordable fashion, I guess.
Everything you said is totally correct. Like, both, it basically has 2 abilities, right? Like, the ability that says whenever you like cast an artifact, make an artifact in the form of a clue token. That's pretty strong. Just like cast an artifact, make an artifact, cast an artifact, make an artifact. Like, that's pretty strong. And then the fact that it also enables the first ability with the second, where like it's reducing, at the very least, it's reducing your clue token's cost from 2 mana to 1 mana. So instead, it's like every clue token is now like 1 mana, sacrifice to draw a card. That's pretty powerful. And then, as you mentioned, that there are other cards like Grim Monolith and Basalt Monolith that now just make infinite mana with this 1 additional card. It's no longer Rings of Brighthearth that are the only cards that make it go infinite. That being said, like, we've talked about like all the positives. Which decks and commanders actually want this card? There's like the decks that are, like, as we said, are already playing Basalt and Grim Monolith and have the blue color identity. Maybe there are going to be decks that have those cards and are not interested in infinite combos. It depends on like what power level your pot is. And I will say, I think one of the commander decks that most wants this card is Urza Lord High Artificer, the mono blue Urza, the first one, because you like cast an artifact, you then make a clue token that costs 1 less because of Forensic Gadgeteer's ability, and then now you can like tap the clue to like to Urza's ability, adding a blue, and just sacrifice it. So it basically becomes like Forensic Gadgeteer plus Urza basically says cast an artifact, draw a card for free. That's what it does. Yeah. So that's an example. But like outside of Urza Lord Eye Artificer, guy, what decks I really want that besides the decks that want combo? I can't really think of many.
Yeah, it doesn't immediately come to my mind.
As powerful as this card is,
this is just a good...
It's still fine. I like that.
Yeah. All right, let's move on to black.
Yes, there's a good number of black cards I like to talk about. This is Case of the Stashed Skeleton. It is 1 and a black for, again, a case. So it starts off with, when this case enters the battlefield, create a 2/1 black skeleton creature token with Suspected. It has menace and can't be blocked. Then to solve, you control no suspected skeletons. And then solved, you have to pay 1 and a black to sacrifice this case, search your library for a card, put it into your hand, then shuffle. Activate only as a sorcery. So, I've seen a little bit of chatter about this card. Basically, it's a 2-mana enchantment. You make a skeleton. Ideally, you want a free sack outlet, like free creature sack outlet to be more specific. You sacrifice the 2/1 skeleton from this case that you get immediately, so that at the beginning of your next end step, you immediately sacrifice the skeleton. But then remember, the third ability says activate only as a sorcery, so you have to wait a full rotation of the table before you can still like pay the 1 and a black, sacrifice the clue, search your library for a card. And so people have been comparing it to Demonic Tutor because like this case is 2 mana. I'd say it's more like one of those 4 mana black spells that search a library, put it to hand. And even then, it's like you have to have at least 1 rotation of the table because, again, the whole activate as a sorcery and the whole like solving thing, it's at the beginning of your end step. So it's I mean, let's not get me wrong. Like, I could totally see my opponent playing this and like basically getting a tutor for like 4 mana, like with their free creature sack outlet, and I'm gonna be scared. Like, I might even lose that turn. But like in terms of like mono black demonic tutor effects, like search your library effects, I'm not that scared.
No, I think this is fine.
Like, if someone demonic tutors, I'm like, oh fuck. Or if someone diabolic tutors, like, I'm like, oh fuck. But like if someone does like Case of the Stash Skeleton, I'm like, okay, I have at least like one rotation of the table to maybe deal with whatever they're fucking getting.
Now we have Persuasive Interrogators, 4 black, creature Gorgon Detective. When it enters the battlefield, investigate, and whenever you sacrifice a clue, target opponent gets 2 poison counters. I think this is cool because it brings poison counters back in a way, but it's not like a relevant way. Like, I think if this would be a lot different if it said whenever you sacrifice a token.
Oh yeah, this would be a totally different card.
Like
it would be so much
token.
Stronger. Oh god.
Yeah.
But it's specifically a clue, which is very niche to like cards that specifically say generate a clue token, or cards that say investigate, which are much fewer in cards that exist.
Yes. So it's cool, but I don't know, like, unless if you do have like a clue heavy deck, I don't think that even then you would be running it. Like, 6 mana is quite a lot.
Yeah.
Just to target a opponent.
I agree. The fact that you're restricted specifically to the tokens being clues, and the fact that this is 6 mana, I think are the 2 factors that really restrict this card from being too busted. I do remember Mark Rosewater's like teasers of how before every set he like reveals some text of some cards, and like the card text he revealed was like, whenever you sacrifice a clue, target opponent gets 2 poison counters. And we were all like, the community at that time who's like pays attention to that stuff is like, oh shit. But the fact that it's like attached to a 6 mana creature and that's restricted to clue tokens specifically, it immediately like nerfs the power level of this card. And I think that's probably a good thing, because if this was too powerful, I think then it would create the whole like, it would raise the whole community of like, oh my god, poison's broken, toxic's broken, infect's broken, and I don't want to deal with that bullshit. So I'm kind of glad that this card was like not busted. And I've seen a number of people be like, oh, well, don't forget that this has an enter the battlefield trigger to investigate, so you can like kill it and reanimate it, kill it and reanimate it. I'm like, okay, yeah, but like, you're like, you'd have to kill it like just in a vacuum. You have to kill it and reanimate it like what? It enters and then like do that like 4 more times where you kill it and reanimate it. That's really hard to do. And then that's only for one player. Like, it's target opponent, not each opponent. So like you'd have to do that like so many more times. And like you said, like unless you're playing a deck that is also making clues in addition to that, like it's just not worth it. So I think this is just a fun Timmy card.
The fact that the fact that clues also require mana to activate, I think is a huge drawback.
Yes. Yeah. Like, you can argue clues are like kind of busted because you don't need to tap them. I get that. But like at the same time, like it's still 2 mana to sacrifice in comparison to Treasure, where you can just like straight up sacrifice it and tap it. So it's a bit of a trade-off. Next card I want to talk about, it is Vein Ripper. It is 3 black. So 6 mana value, 6/5 for a creature vampire assassin with flying, and it has a ward ability of sacrifice a creature. So if you want to target the Vein Ripper, you have to sacrifice a creature, otherwise it's countered. Whenever a creature dies, target opponent loses 2 life and you gain 2 life. So straight off the bat, it's very similar to Blood Artist, in the sense that like whenever a creature dies, like you can basically target an opponent to like lose some life and you gain some life. The notable difference is the fact that this costs like 6 fucking mana, whereas Blood Artist is only 2. So Vein Ripper is worse because like it costs way more mana. And like part of the reason it costs way more mana is that it's a scale of 2 life, gain 2 life, like lose 2 life, gain 2 life. Whereas Blood Artist, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, guy, is gain 1 life and lose 1 life. But every deck that is playing Blood Artist is basically doing bullshit where like they're like tons of death triggers to where, or like combos to where the number per like creature dying doesn't really matter. And so I can totally see certain deck builders being like, man, I play Blood Artist. I really wish I had a second Blood Artist. And then Vein Ripper has now been reprinted. And they're like, oh, like it sucks that it's 6 mana, but like I still want to play it because it's basically a second Blood Artist, like another quote unquote combo piece or like near combo piece. So I can totally see myself losing to like a Vein Ripper because Blood Artist just scares me that much.
Yeah, I mean, Blood Artist, I think, is going to be, like, the, top of aristocrat-type effects that do this. Yeah. Vein Ripper, I think, comes in close. Yeah. The fact that it also has, like, ward sacrifice a creature, so,
it's gonna stick
if
around.
You do want to, like, target
People do not like sacrificing their stuff.
Right.
Unless they absolutely have to because they're about to lose the game. Or they're a token deck and they don't care. And like other than that, like people are not going to target.
And
this.
They would lose 2 life too, and get yeah. This really reads as like 4 life because they lose 2, you gain 2, so it's like a 4 life difference.
Oh, I can also read this next card because I included it last minute, but for a reason. All right, this is Snarling Gorehound. It is a single black mana for a 1/1 creature dog menace. So it's a very small creature, but the main reason I included it is because it has the text that says, whenever another creature with power 2 or less enters the battlefield under your control, surveil 1. So reminder, surveil 1 is look at the top card of your library, you may put it into your graveyard. And the reason I put this is kind of similar to Blood Artist, where like if you have like a number of pieces together, especially if you have like infinite creature like sack outlet and like return to battlefield, this is just a 1 mana, like a single black pip that says like you can basically stack the top of your library however you want, and like also just fill up your graveyard like completely as much as you want. So I can totally see this in like certain like similar to Blood Artist sort of decks where like you have all these like little pieces that inevitably come together and suddenly like you've gone infinite and you've able to do something infinitely and you win. Like Snarling Gorehound can just like fill up your graveyard completely.
Yeah,
it's probably one of the most, and basically it's one of the most efficient effects I've seen for that. Yeah, at 1 mana, at a single black mana.
All right, so now we're on to red. This is Case of the Crimson Pulse, which is 2 in a red. So when it enters the battlefield, discard a card, draw 2 cards, and in order to solve, you have to have no cards in your hand. And once it's solved, it has a static ability of, at the beginning of your upkeep, discard your hand, then draw 2 cards. So what's cool about this is, like, at the beginning of your upkeep, if you have no cards to discard, you're just like, okay, discard those, you draw 2 cards, and then you go to your draw step, you draw a 3rd card. So this really would read as, like, draw 3 cards a turn.
I was kind of thinking, like, in terms of your Purpose deck, where, like, you are a mono-red deck that just can't easily refill, you just burn through your hand so quickly that, like, you solve almost every time that you play this. And, like, you discard like your hand of like 0 and like always like then draw 2. Yeah, kind of what you're saying.
Yeah, I think I'm a little reluctant to try this in Purpose because I just don't like the forceful discard part of it, because sometimes there are things I want to keep and I would like to play at a certain time. But in other red decks that just like need the card advantage, I think this is a good potential.
All right, this next card is called Connecting the Dots. It is 1 and a red, so 2 mana value, an enchantment that says whenever a creature you control attacks, exile the top card of your library face down. You can't look at it. And then 1 and a black to discard your hand. Sacrifice Connecting the Dots. Put all cards exiled with Connecting the Dots into their owner's hand. So this card really says, hey, if you have a deck that has creatures attacking a whole lot, you're basically going to exile cards off the top of your library in proportion to those that you can't look at. But for just like 2 more mana and sacrificing this enchantment, you're going to get them all to your hand the turn you do that. And honestly, that's pretty appealing just because it's relatively mana efficient. It feels very red, where it's like impulsive draw in a way. And like, for example, I'm thinking of including Connecting the Dots in my Aurelia the War Leader deck. The Aurelia that says like it can attack twice each turn. Like if Aurelia is my only card on the field, it's like, hey, I'm getting 2 cards every time. And after like maybe 3 turns of doing that, maybe less, depending if I have more creatures. Like, especially if you have decks that say like do multiple combats, like the Mole God we were just talking about. If you can do multiple combats each turn, or like really go wide and swing in, like this card seems great for those.
Yeah. All right. Next we have Crime Novelist. 2 in a red, creature, Goblin Bard. Whenever you sacrifice an artifact, put a +1/+1 counter on Crime Novelist and add red mana. And it's 1/3. So this basically reads as whenever you sack a treasure, you get to add 2 mana instead of 1. One of those being has to be red. But yeah, it doubles up on your treasure tokens. So, you know, again, like Dockside Extortionist, which is one of the best treasure makers in the game. Just treasure matters in general. Like, I think Magda would probably really like this. That's another deck, mono red deck that likes to make treasures.
Yes.
And just with the relevance of treasures in general, like this, I feel like this can, you know, be a card that exponentially just gets better in the future.
Yes, I think I agree with that, where if there's any card that cares about treasures, you then consider this card. As you mentioned, Dockside is a very powerful card, one of the most powerful cards in the format these days. This basically is giving you 2 mana for every treasure being cracked. So therefore, like, it cares about commanders like the original Corvold. It cares about Ready Scrap Savant. I think another comparison I've heard about this card is similar to Birgi, God of Storytelling, like the front side, because it's kind of like Birgi, where it's like you do a thing, you make an additional red mana. I think it's a bit more niche than Birgi, but I still think that's a pretty like honorific comparison if you're being compared to Birgi, because Birgi is generally considered a very strong card.
Yeah, I agree. I see that.
All right, next up we have one of the very first cards revealed from this set, I think. It is Demand Answers. It is 1 and a red for an instant. All right, low cost and easy to cast. Love it. As an additional cost to cast this spell, sacrifice an artifact or discard a card. So it's pretty flexible in that regard. Draw 2 cards. 2 mana instant, draw 2 cards, and it gives you the flexibility of either discarding a card or sacrificing an artifact. Like, I like this. I think it's probably one of the like highest played 99 cards based on edhrec.com, and I can see why. It's very flexible, it's easy to cast, it's relatively powerful in terms of like it's one of those quote-unquote looting effects between like, what is it, like faithless looting and like the other type of looting effects. I think this just like slots in to kind of fit into the theme of like temporary impulsive card draw. Yeah, I like it.
Yeah, the fact that it's an instant is kind of just an upgrade against similar cards like Tormenting Voice.
That's the other card I couldn't remember. Tormenting Voice. Thank you.
Yeah. And the fact that you can also, you have the option between sacrificing an artifact and discarding a card, I think is pretty nice. Okay, so now we have Onsrog's Rampage. I don't know if I said that completely correctly. So 3 red, sorcery, destroy all artifacts you don't control. Then exile the top X cards of your library, where X is the number of artifacts that were put into the graveyard from the battlefield this turn. You may put a creature card exiled this way onto the battlefield. It gains haste. Return it to your hand at the beginning of the next end step. So this is pretty good. It's kind of like a pseudo polymorph type effect, I guess. A lot of the times where I guess you see like sneak attack, I think is like the most famous example of like putting a creature onto the field, cheating its mana cost. You often have to like sacrifice it, but this would just put it back into your hand instead. You are also destroying all artifacts you don't control, which is nice. I think the only other thing that so like the other thing is like it doesn't just matter, like, you know, they have a bunch of treasures, they sack it in response. It says that we're put into the graveyard from the battlefield this turn, so it doesn't matter whether or not you actually destroyed them. They're point. Gonna have to, you know, yeah. So I think this is pretty good. I think the fact though that like if you destroy like 10 things and you exile 10 cards off the top of your library, you aren't going to get the 10 cards back. Like, they don't shuffle into your library. Those will remain in exile with the 1 card that you did get to, you know, play.
That's fair. I think the reason I included this card was because I think about the card Vandal Blast, which is pretty similar to this card in regards to like the first line of text, where it basically, like, whenever someone plays Vandal Blast, they're almost always overloading it. It's true that you can like not overload it, but let's be honest, most people are overloading Vandal Blast when they cast it. And Ansarag's Rampage is basically that plus upside. And so given how popular Vandal Blast is, I felt compelled to add this to the list of cards we talk about, because it's basically Vandal Blast plus upside. And I feel like this card, unfortunately, will not see as much play as I think it should, because like it's like based on the naming and like the art, it's going to be like not reprinted a whole bunch like Vandal Blast will be.
Yeah, I guess that is a good point, where it's like less likely to be reprinted because of the name. And Vandal Blast does have, you know, nice flexibility of being able to be cast for 1. But yeah, most of the time you do cast it for like the 5. Mm-hmm. So, you know, I could see, you know, maybe, I mean, 1 Vandal Blast is good, 2 Vandal Blast is better. So, you know, yeah, I think this should probably see more play.
Well, that all being said, we have more cards to talk about. Let's move into green. We have Aftermath Analyst. It is 1 and a green for a 1/3 creature elf detective. When it enters the battlefield, mill 3 cards. And then it has an activated ability of 3 and a green, sacrifice Aftermath Analyst. Return all land cards from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. So, straight off the board, this is very similar to cards like World Shaper, where World Shaper is like, oh, if this creature goes to the graveyard, return all lands to your battlefield. And so it's very similar in that regard, except Aftermath Analyst is able to sacrifice itself for the cost of 3 and a green. So I like it more so in that dimension. And then on top of that, it also fills the graveyard because it ETBs and mills 3, so I like it more than World Shaper in that regard. I think one of the best comparisons besides World Shaper is the card Splendid Reclamation, which sees a whole ton of play in like landfall-centric decks, because like playing the Aftermath Analyst and then activating the ability, because you can do it the same turn. It's not a tap ability for the activated. Like you can, in theory, play 4 for the activated, and then like also 2 for casting in the first place, so a total of 6. It's basically another Splendid Reclamation for 6 mana, if you really needed it to. And then at the very least, it like ETB'd and milled 3, so that's adding fuel to the fire. So I think this is a low-key card that I'm really, really high on because of World Shaper and Splendid Reclamation seeing such high play in landfall decks. Like, I know our friend Park is going to play this in his Omnath, a Locust of Rage landfall deck, and I'm not looking forward to it because it's going to be so good.
Yeah, and it's an elf, which is just a relevant creature type in general.
Yeah.
So, no, this is good.
All right, next up. You should read this card. This is a good card.
Yeah, Analyze the Pollen. So this is green mana, sorcery. As an additional cost to cast a spell, you may collect Evidence 8, so you don't have to. Search your library for a basic land card. If evidence was collected, instead search your library for a creature or land card, reveal that card, put it into your hand, then shuffle. So I think this is pretty good in terms of like, you know, early game, first turn, cast. You're not going to be able to collect the evidence, so okay, you'll just go and find
a forest.
I don't know. Your basic land,
forest or plains, depending what color.
Later in the game, though, yeah, but then later in the game, when you can collect the evidence, this can go find a critical land piece like, you know, Glacial Chasm, Gaia's Cradle, yeah, like Field of the Dead, like, you know, really strong lands because it, you know, takes out the basic type, or it becomes like a Mystical Tutor or Sylvan Tutor type effect where, yeah, you can go now find a creature and put it into hand for 1 green mana with Collect Evidence 8. But no, this is also, I think, pretty solid.
I think that's a good way of thinking about it, is like Sylvan Tutor, where it's like a single green mana and a sorcery, and you're basically searching up your library for something. I've also heard comparisons to Traverse the Uvenwald, which is a single green to cast. It's a sorcery, and it's very similar to this effect, where like as long as you meet Delirium, which is having 4 or more card types in your graveyard, you can search for either creature or land. That's like the most direct comparison, but like nobody plays Traverse the Uvenwald because people generally cannot have 4 or more card types in their graveyard. However, I think Analyze the Pollen is better in that regard because Collect Evidence 8 is a bit more flexible. It doesn't matter like if you have all creatures, it doesn't matter if you have all enchantments or artifacts or like planeswalkers or a combination of anything. As long as their mana value is 8, like you can just get rid of them and like search up any land, any creature for a single green mana mid to late game, which is a lot easier to do, even though it's not Delve, like as I complained about before, where you can get rid of lands. To collect 8, it's easier than collect Evidence 10, you know? And this time you only have to do it a single time, whereas the Blue Sphinx has like every time you cast a spell, you have to collect Evidence 10. So for that, I'm like kind of like thinking that this is a good card. Needless to say, as we've said before, if you're gonna like do collect evidence cards, you're gonna need a deck that fills up the graveyard pretty consistently. But like green decks, especially green black decks, are really, really known within Commander color identities to fill up the graveyard. And like there are plenty of other color identities that include green that can fill up the graveyard as well, like blue green and hell, like just other ones that can totally do that. I'm pretty high on this card actually.
Yeah.
Next up, we have Archdruid's Charm, which I'm just going to say off the bat is similar to Archmage's Charm. So this might be a super cycle of charms that we'll see over the course of like the next 1, 2, maybe 3 years. I'm pretty excited. Like we've already got the blue one, now this is the green one. Hopefully we will see like the red and the white and like the other ones. So yeah, anyways, this is Archdruid's Charm. It is green, green, green. So triple green mana for an instant that says choose one, and there's 3 modes. Mode 1, search your library for a creature or land card and reveal it. Put it onto the battlefield tapped if it's a land card, otherwise put it into your hand, then shuffle. Mode 2, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. It deals damage equal to its power to target creature you don't control. Mode 3, exile target artifact or enchantment. So this is just amazing. Like the first mode is searching a creature or a land. The second mode is removal in the form of like basically like a fight effect. And then mode 3 is a removal spell in terms of artifact and enchantment. And especially the fact that it exiles. I know a lot of people have been talking about like the One Ring, which is indestructible. Hey, this exiles that bullshit. Like I was telling you like an episode or two ago, like in Casual Commander, exiling an artifact isn't that big of a deal. Or an enchantment, like, hey, you can exile Guy's Perforos, so like, it doesn't matter that it's indestructible, just exile it. It doesn't even matter. His commander doesn't even matter. Screw him. Or you could just get your Guy's Cradle, or you could kill a creature that's giving you grief. This card is just so flexible. The only downside is the fact that it's like triple green mana to cast, so like you probably are leaning towards like being a mono green deck or a 2-color deck, but that's really the only downside of this card. I'm actually really high on this compared to like the mono blue like charm in this cycle. Like in theory this is going to be a super cycle, which really didn't do much. Like I'm actually pretty high on this one. What do you think, Guy?
No, I think you kind of nailed it. Like these are all really relevant effects. Like the fact too that like, you know, +1/+1 counters, like in those types of decks that like care about that a lot, like oftentimes you'll like double up on those, and then this just turns into like a removal spell too for that type of creature. And exiling artifacts and enchantments, yeah, very relevant. The fact that it's also like any land, like again, like go find your Glacial Chasm, Field of the Dead, like okay, like, you know, Seedborn Muse is a card that we see pretty often, so I feel like untapping is not going to be that hard if you're, you know, looking to try and do things immediately. But yeah, I would be very curious and hope that, you know, if this is like a super cycle that we see in the future among sets, like, yeah, that the other ones are just as powerful as like these first two.
Yeah, specifically the green one. The blue one doesn't really do much. All right, next up, I think, well, actually, first, the last thing I'll say is like I know people have been comparing this to crop rotation, at least for the first ability, whereas like crop rotation is a single green mana for an instant, and this is a 3 mana for an instant. Like the positive side to this charm is that like it's more flexible because there's 3 modes, and it also gets like a potential creature to hand. But like the upside to crop rotation is that it gets the land into play on tap. So like crop rotation is really much more for like landfall based decks or like land centric decks, whereas this Archdruid charm is much more flexible and like maybe a little bit more casual because it's like triple green. But nevertheless, I'm still really excited about this card. I like this card. Next up is a card I included. I'm just going to mention it really quick because I only included this for my own selfish, personally reasons. It is Case of the Locked Hothouse. It is 3 and a green for a Case enchantment. So again, one of those new Case cards. The static ability says you may play an additional land on each of your turns. To solve, you control 7 or more lands. And then solved is you may look at the top card of your library anytime. You may play lands and cast creature and enchantment spells from the top of your library. So the reason I included this card is because I'm selfish, and I think about like my Sigarda Host of Herons Enchantress Voltron deck, where it's an enchantment. So like my Enchantress deck wants this card because it's going to draw cards every time I play an enchantment. It's going to let me play additional lands per turn, which is what the deck wants to do already because it draws so many cards. Like, controlling 7 or more lands isn't that difficult when the static ability says I can play 2 or more lands per turn. And then the last ability, where I can play lands, creatures, and enchantments, that's basically 95% of the deck. Like, literally, there's like 5 cards that are like instants or sorceries or like planeswalkers. And so it basically, like, once I have solved this, it basically says, hey, look at the top card of your library. You can cast it if you have the mana. And so I can just like go hog wild. So that's me. That's probably a lot of outside of my world. It probably fits like Scythus decks and other Enchantress heavy decks that lean towards green. I'm willing to bet.
Yeah, and like ramping in green is not that hard. I feel like to solve control 7 or more lands. If you have 4 mana, like, you know, playing this on turn 4, having very close to maybe 7 lands is not unreasonable. Alright, next we have Undergrowth Recon. 1 green enchantment. At the beginning of your upkeep, return target land card from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. So in a way, this is kind of like a Crucible of Worlds type ability where you can get lands out of your graveyard. This being, though, that like it's not the land that you play, so it's almost like doubling up. So like a lot of the times you're probably going to be getting back like fetch lands or, you know, things that like purposely go to the graveyard to give you abilities.
Right. I think this kind of reminds me a little bit of Crucible of Worlds, in terms of like old school Commander. People used to play this all the time to like play a land, especially if it was a fetch land, and then get it back so that they could ramp. That was like back when lands weren't as good. And this, it's just sort of like, I think the fact that it's limited to the beginning of your upkeep, and that it enters tapped actually kind of prevents this. Like I was pretty high when this card first came out, but then I remembered like, oh, it's like limited to your upkeep. The land enters tapped. It can be whatever land, but like, let's be realistic. If you're returning it from the graveyard, either it's a fetch land because like you want to have that value to like constantly meet your land drops per turn, yeah, or someone finally spent the resources to blow up like your super strong land, like your Gaia's Cradle or your Glacial Chasm. Like Glacial Chasm might be the exception where like it self-sacrifices and you just want it back. Like in which case, like hooray, you can like now reuse those super powerful lands. So like I'm not saying this is a super strong card. I'm not saying this is a super weak card. I'm saying this is like a reasonably strong card in the middle. How do you feel about it?
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, I think probably the most degenerate stuff is, yeah, getting back like maybe Glacial Chasm after like sending it to the graveyard for not paying the upkeep cost. You could get back Wasteland or like Strip Mines, things like that, but that's also, you know, you'd have to like wait a turn to then use it on the next turn.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking, where it's like, especially when like your opponent has like a Zeus of Lost but Seeking and like an Oracle of Moldiah and a Crucible of World type effect, it's like where they just like strip mine lock you. I'm like, you can't do that with this card because it's limited to the beginning of the upkeep. Yeah. All right, moving on. We still got a few more cards we want to talk about, and we're already past the 2-hour mark. So, and we still got more to talk about a little bit after that. So we're going to wrap up here. We're moving into the multicolor and then the colorless decks, and then we're going to talk about the Rules Committee announcements. So for the multicolor, I wanted to talk about it. It is a card called Urgent Necropsy. Urgent Necropsy. 2 black and a green for an instant that says, as an additional cost to cast a spell, collect evidence X, where X is the total mana value of the permanents this spell targets. Return up to 1 target artifact, up to 1 target creature, up to 1 target enchantment, and up to 1 target planeswalker. So this is like a 4 mana instant speed removal spell that you need like a pretty filled up graveyard if you want to remove like one of each thing, that being an artifact, a creature, an enchantment, a planeswalker. This is Commander, so like most, like the average pod isn't going to have a planeswalker, but like I think it's pretty solid and safe to say like there's going to be an enchantment, a creature, and an artifact you want to get rid of, and so like you better have a full graveyard for that. I know a number of people talked about this card being similar to Decimate, where Decimate was a like black and red card, I think, that was like sorcery speed and removed the same type of permanence, but the downside with Decimate is like you had to have all 4 targets be legal. If somebody like used the Swords of Plowshare on the creature, like the Decimate now fizzled and didn't get rid of the other things. Then it was sorcery, so it was like slower. But like Decimate is like an all-time well-known like Commander card I don't see it as much anymore now that we've moved out of the 2010s and are now in the 2020s. But it's definitely one of those. Decimate is one of those OG commander cards that I no longer see as much play. And seeing Urgent Necropsy just kind of reminded me of that. I just want to talk about it. Made me feel nostalgic.
It doesn't need the targets necessarily. Like, I think it makes it a lot more playable. The collect evidence, though, to like equal the amount of mana that you want to target. Like, because it's like, you know, if you're targeting a 4 mana value enchantment, 2 mana artifact, and I don't know, like a 3 mana creature, like, you know, that all adds up, and you need to like make sure that you also have the specific cards in your graveyard to like exile and equal up to that. So like, it does ask a lot, but you know, instant speed and can hit up to a lot of things. It can be strong.
Exactly. Like, I like it as it's no Assassin's Trophy, but it's a Golgari like instant speed removal spell that I like. I like the design of it. I like that it's a callback to like 2010's Commander life.
Yeah. Alright, so last multicolored card is War Leader's Call. 1 red-white enchantment. Creatures you control get +1/+1. And whenever a creature enters the battlefield under your control, War Leader's Call deals 1 damage to each opponent. So it's, I think, a very good combination of classic red and white effects. You get an Anthem, the white, and then whenever a creature enters the battlefield, deal damage to each opponent. So I think that, you know, as we've talked about like other Boros commanders and things to do, like this is a pretty good card that can go into those decks.
Yeah, I just think that this card, War Leader's Call, is good in not just like Boros decks, but specifically go wide creature token decks, because it's all creatures, whether they're tokens or not. So like, let's say you go wide with tokens, they now have +1/+1, and especially if those tokens are like go wide +1, like 1/1 tokens, well, now they're twice as powerful. And then more importantly, I think the most important line of text is the second half, which says whenever a creature enters the battlefield under your control, War Leader's Call deals 1 damage to each opponent. That includes, like, again, whether they're tokens or non-tokens. So I think one of the major struggles with token decks is like, they can win, but like one of the difficulties about them is that like sometimes you have to go to combat and like connecting and like actually going through all the steps of combat and like dealing the combat damage. There's a lot of ways for things to go wrong for you. And so if you can just simply like cast your tokens and then like trigger your War Leader's Call to where like they enter the battlefield and like deal damage to each opponent. So like, say you make 20 tokens, you've now reduced, like in theory, you've now brought all of your opponent's life totals from 40 to 20. You've now halved their life total. And so like you just do that again and like you've won the game. And so I think that this is a really strong card for tokens decks that include red-white.
Yeah. All right, we got one more card, Blake. Take us home.
All right, so lastly, this is kind of an interesting card. I personally have been really bad about assessing colorless cards, and I've been trying to get better about that in our set reviews. And so in an effort to do so, I'd like to talk about Escape Tunnel. It is a land card, which says, sacrifice Escape Tunnel, search your library for a basic land card, put it onto the battlefield tapped, then shuffle. So it's basically like Evolving Wilds, which is pretty much like a staple in Casual Commander. But this also, in addition, says, tap, sacrifice, Escape Tunnel, target creature with power 2 or less can't be blocked this turn. So it pretty much has Evolving Wilds and Terramorphic Expanse plus upside. And so as we know, those other cards are like pretty much like Casual Commander staples, whereas this card I don't think is going to see as much play as it should, because it's basically those cards but better, because it's going to be limited to this set. I don't think it's going to be printed as much. People aren't going to get their hands on it. Like, there's a whole bunch of commanders that are going to be like power 2 or less, and are going to want to never be blocked at the cost of like sacrificing a land if it means getting it and winning the game. So I'm going to buy this card. I'm going to buy this land. and I think I just want people to be aware of it, because I feel like it's kind of been a card that people have forgotten about in listening to all these other set reviews. People have forgotten about this card. I think this card is actually, like, just because it's not going to be printed as much as Evolving Wilds and Terramorphic Expanse, people are going to forget about this, especially because it's a land. And I feel like that's really sad, because it's powerful.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely like a small power creep to Evolving Wilds or like Terramorphic Expanse, but it's can be relevant.
So we've now finished talking about Murders at Karlov Manor. We are now moving into the very last section of the episode. Thank you all for sticking around so far. We are now going to talk about the Rules Committee announcements. There's not just one, but two announcements that came out like within this first quarter of the year. And Guy, I'm going to let you talk about it.
All right. So our first announcement came on the 27th of January. So in light of Sheldon's passing, they announced that they were going to be still continuing with the State of the Format articles. The biggest difference, though, is instead of being posted onto the Star City Games website, this would now just be posted onto the Commander website instead, which I think is smart, because that way, you can reference those for future going back, and, it just gives the website more traction.
Yes, especially since, years and years ago, people complained about the fact that, those were behind a paywall at the time, and then eventually, years later, Sheldon was like, okay, it's no longer behind a paywall, but I still wanted to bring that up, where, that information should be available to the general public if they can seek it out for free. And so I like this change.
Yeah. And so one of the big changes, though, that they talked about in this is that they were going to, and already did, create a transparent or give reasoning to why each card is on the ban list. So when you go to the ban list now, you can hover over it, and it gives you a small paragraph about why the card is deemed bannable for the format, which I think is great, because a lot of people kind of question, why is this card on the ban list? But now you can go and read whether or not you agree with their assessment. But yeah, I think this would help clear up a lot of confusion.
On that note, the one thing I will say about this is, I was talking with my friend Park, and he was talking about how their explanations were pretty lackluster. He didn't really like their explanations. They were very surface level and weren't fully explanatory. And I hear what he's saying, and I feel as more veteran, experienced players, I agree with him. But at the same time, I agree with what the current Rules Committee is doing, where they are essentially adding to their website explaining why each card is banned in relatively simple and easy terms to understand, because as many veteran Commander players as there are way more brand new Commander players who either don't know of this website or are just learning about it, and they're why is this banned in the first place? And I know this to be true from just playing card games in general, whether it's Yu-Gi-Oh! Or Pokemon or just any card game. It's you always want to know the explanation of why a card is banned. And so oftentimes you have to go hunting for these explanation videos on YouTube or whatever format you can, or whatever article. And it can be really just off-putting to then have to spend the additional effort. It's really refreshing to have an explanation in why these cards are banned. So as lackluster as it may feel as a veteran Commander player, it is incredibly beneficial, as a majority of the players are more towards the newer perspective of Commander, and especially within the last couple of years where Commander has exploded, it's more most of the Commander player base is more towards the newer perspective of things.
Yeah. So that was the first announcement, And then about a week later, we got our quarterly update, which comes out with every pre-release for every major set. So this one coincides with Murders at Karlov Manor. And surprise, surprise, no cards were banned, no cards were unbanned, no rules change. And just in general, the format continues to be in a pretty good place overall. And, you know, we'll see if anything changes when Outlaws at Thunder Junction come along in April.
Yep. I think you and I are both fine about that. I think the two of us are sort of like of the mindset of the fewer the ban list changes, the better, the more stable the format is.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like, you know, maybe you could look at a few cards and like consider whether or not they come off, but like I don't think there's anything that like, you know, needs to come off right away. Like, you know, I guess we'll just kind of concede, you know, when the next card does get banned, if a card gets banned, like, yeah, why? But it's been a long time since, and I think, you know, that just, again, testifies to the fact that, like, Wizards is doing a good job creating, you know, cards that for the format that aren't too broken. Players are able to, you know, create healthy discussions within their play groups. Nothing's like immediately popping out. So yeah, we're in a good spot.
Okay, so we are recording this on the 10th of February of 2024. Guy, what do you think is going to be the next crazy thing that disturbs the Commander community?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, something's going to happen with the Fallout Commander decks, probably. You know,
is that what's next?
Yeah, we should be getting previews for those probably in the next 2 weeks, I think, at the time of recording this.
All right, so we'll see how successful those are, because either a lot of the Universes Beyond IPs are like pretty successful. Sometimes they're a flop, like the Doctor Who's, but sometimes they're an absolute smash hit, like the Hammer 40k. So I guess we'll have to wait and see.
Yeah, I'm hoping that these... I feel like the Doctor Who ones were very specific to Doctor Who. I feel like the Fallout ones can be a little more broad. So we'll just see, I guess.
Yeah. Ooh, maybe they'll all have AI art.
Oh, cool. Yeah.
God, I hope not. Fuck.
All right. So, we are the Wizard Staff Podcast. You can listen to us on iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, YouTube, and anywhere else you like to listen to your podcasts. Make sure to leave a like and review. You can follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at the Wizard Staff 101. You can send us an email at thewizardstaff101@gmail.com if you want to bitch and complain about how stupid we are. We thank you for listening, and we hope you have a great evening. Peace.
Peace.